Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar entitled Fueling Forward, the Mid-Year Risk Review and Outlook. My name is Nick Zulovich, part of the team at Cherokee Media Group, and pleased to welcome you to our session today, featuring two of the experts from Allied Solutions, John Elias and Brooke Stewart. And as we're about at the halfway point of 2025, lenders are certainly navigating some rapidly changing landscape conditions in auto finance, rising delinquencies, a shifting the regulatory framework, and consumer behaviors that are evolving significantly as well. And it's all putting pressure on those outstanding portfolios, creating both risks and fresh opportunities. So we'll get a glimpse into some of those opportunities and some of the recap of what's happened so far this year. Again, with our special guests from Allied Solutions, John Elias and Brooke Stewart. Gentlemen, take it away. The webinar is yours.
Nick, thanks for the time and thanks for our partnership with Cherokee Media. Let's jump into the rising risks that are going on in the portfolio stressors. So, if we could move forward on the slide, there's been quite a few pressure points that have popped up over the last 3 to 4 years as we've come out of COVID that continue to evolve and change the market. One of those is interest rates. One of those is the inflation and how it's impacting the customers' budgets. And then vehicle prices. We still haven't seen them come down. A lot of that has to do with the uncertainty of the tariffs and the change in the administrations and in the direction that they're taking our tariffs and what we're doing in the auto industry. But we'll really start to talk about the interest rates and how they, from when we got before COVID, they were at an all-time low, and then now we're back to what I would consider, historical norms from an interest rate perspective. But really, the people that are buying cars today are really being impacted from that, from a dollar per vehicle that they're being able to spend, and that with what's going on with the prices and the limited number of used vehicles, and then the tariffs that are going on with the new vehicles is really starting to put pressure on the customer's budget. So, John, you want to speak a little bit about what we're seeing from the lenders and how they're being impacted by this?
Yeah, absolutely. And Nick, I echo Brooke's comments. First of all, thank you for allowing us to come in and be a part of this. And thank you to everyone out there that's taking time out of their day to sit and listen to Brooks and I kind of share with you things that we're seeing at Allied Solutions, things that we're hearing from our customers, and really kind of directionally, we're hearing the most sentiment. Where's that resting? What are these folks doing to be proactive in the marketplace? So yeah, if you haven't heard, the inflation cost of vehicles and vehicle ownership is much higher than the actual inflation rate, while wages are still continuing to lag just the standard inflation in general. So one of the things that we like to look at is some contributing factors, which would be insurance rates are up 22.6% in the last 12 months. So think of that. Cost of ownership, cost of insurance, that's increased 22.6%, with potentially 7 additional percent coming in play by the beginning of 2026. Natural disasters are predicted to be increased this year, as they are almost every year. Consumers are also faced with repair costs that have gone up over the last few years, over 35%. And that could be just due to the actual repairs themselves, but parts themselves are also elevated at this particular time. One thing that hasn't gone away, which I think the consumers are now facing, or would be student loans. And if you think about that, a $40,000 student loan, that payment's $526 per month. And I think recently the administration has enabled student loans to be again reported on the credit reports. And then the average age of the vehicle on the road today is 12.6 years. And it goes right to Brooks's point, right? Of, hey, the cost of a new vehicle is elevated currently. Financing for that vehicle is elevated. It's really putting the consumer in a tough position when you have an average price of $48,000 on new. And then you kind of have for that recently used, that gap is narrowing, whereas 30,000 narrowing between new and used. So, and then of course, some of the refi companies that we work with today are seeing noticeably payment to income changes of close to 30-35%. That's tough, right? So, when you think about all of these headwinds that consumers are facing, it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting time that we live in today.
Yeah, John, I agree with that 100%. And, some of the things that you look at that it's leading to is higher repossessions, right? We saw
Oh,
higher repossessions in 2024. We're trending toward an increase in 2025. We haven't seen a huge number of repossession agents come back to the market post COVID. We are starting to see a little bit of that, but that's continuing to put pressure on recoveries, which ultimately is driving down profitability inside of lenders from those loans that were originated back in 21, 22, and 23. One of the things that John talked about there was the increase in prices and the pressure. Let's not forget that we lost about 14 million new cars that should have been produced in 2020, 2021, and 2022 because of COVID and because of those things. So, as John talks about the average price of the average age of the car on the road being 12 years, we don't see any insight at Allied in that over the next couple of years until we start to see that SAR number, which is the number of new vehicles produced, start to get back to historical norms around that 17 and a half to 18 million new vehicles produced. So, I see this as a short-term blip in the world, but I see that we're going to be in this trend for the next, 18 to 24 months. I think when you talk about overall values of assets and how they're affecting our portfolios, we talked about the negatives in the values. The positives is that the asset values at auction on the vehicles that do have to be recovered are continuing to stay strong, and so it is helping that impact of that delinquency and that charge-off amount, which in most lenders that we work with on a daily basis are at all-time highs on a per vehicle and a per account charge-off basis when they go delinquent. So as we move forward, we'll talk a little bit about tightening regulations. I mentioned it in the opening about the change in the administration and some of the changes in philosophy with the CFPB and some of the different things that are starting to come to fruition there. John, do you want to take this one and talk a little bit about what we're seeing from that perspective?
yeah. I just had one quick question for you, Brooks. And you and I have been in this industry for a long time. We've seen this go through cycles, right? So delinquencies are up 16% from 2023 and 43% from 2022. And I had a couple of thoughts on that. And again, I would like to get your opinion on it. Do you think lenders are now pricing this risk? So this is the new sustainable higher delinquency rate? Or do you think this just all kind of blows up and you start to see a tidal wave of repossessions, massive losses, freezes on credit availability, which is very reminiscent of a 2008, 2009 period?
No, I don't see that we see a mass blow up of portfolios. I think we've worked through the majority of that over the last 18 to 24 months as we've exited COVID. I think what you're seeing now is new originations down and, people having to come up with more money down to be able to get into a vehicle. Lenders have adjusted with the higher interest rates. They've tightened credit. We've seen most of the lenders that we work with on a daily basis in some of our products, their originations are way down from where they were, even a year and a half ago. So I think they're adjusting by saying, hey, unless we're putting the right customer on the books, we don't want to put them at risk of increasing their delinquency because their overall servicing cost has gone up over the past 3 years with this delinquency rate. And so it's putting pressure on their return on investment from their portfolio perspective.
Interesting. Yeah. One other thought on that before we jump into regulations, because this thing gets, even a little more precarious. So new car sales slipped in May, down 3% from April, kind of that hangover that you saw from the kind of the tariff speculation that was going on in March and April as sales started to escalate. So where do you think that, at least from a sales perspective, do you think the OEMs who are already trying to figure out how to work together to combat this tariff situation, but do they go heavy into incentives, or do you see that shift back to used vehicles where they become the the primary asset or the primary vehicle that the dealership's looking to move?
So from all the years I've been doing this, one of the things that I've been watching closely is the rebates, right? And how those are starting to be layered back in. One of the things that I think is actually more prevalent today, especially with some of these new car dealers that have their own captive finance company, you're not seeing as much of the incentives as you are the interest rate reductions, right? For limited time. So you used to see a manufacturer come out with 0% or 0.9% for 60 months. You're starting to see that more of a 0.9% for 36 months or even a 24 months. So you can see that they're easing back into seeing where the water is warm again before they just jump back in feet first with, hey, we're going to do 0% for 60 months or even 72 months, depending on the manufacturer. But what I am seeing is very specific around certain products and things that as you get above that $60,000 mark, you're starting to see more and more of those. So it's more to come on that. I think it's really early to see what's going to happen with that. I think once we get through some of this tariff negotiations and what they're doing, I don't think it's going to, my personal opinion, I don't think it's going to be a huge impact long-term. It's a short-term blip. I do think the bigger impact is cost of parts or used vehicles. So, it might actually push people that are in a used vehicle, the repair cost to get that repaired, it might actually be cheaper for them to go to a new and trade that in. So something to watch as we move forward here in 2025.
Yeah, that's an interesting. We've seen an increase in total loss, right? Where it's just become too expensive to fix some of these vehicles. We see that in our data. So no, I agree 100%. Yeah, thank you for those insights. So jumping into regs and regulations. So the CFPB and the FTC have really zeroed in on lending practices. And that means from the fees to the disclosures to repossession handling. If what we're seeing continues to be the trend, where increased repossessions, obviously these are areas that have high consumer sensitivity. Consumers become very vocal about this, right? And if these practices are not being followed very closely, obviously it opens the door for either a regulator or a litigator to then become involved. There's a clear push for transparency and fairness. Really, the way that you think of this is their position would be, what is in the best interest of a consumer outcome? How can you ensure that the consumer reaches the optimal outcome in whatever event that you're currently going through, albeit a total loss or repossession, abandonment, whatever that may be? It is really a push for ensuring that the consumer has the best outcome. And really the consequences for this non-compliance will be from increased audits to large fines and penalties. And let's not, again, forget about class action law firms who specialize in auto lending practices. They're still there and they're watching these things very closely, especially if there's something that's picked up by one of the regulators at whatever level that may be, a federal or state. They're paying attention to these things and then they begin to look for opportunities. So if we move on to the next slide.
John, let me add one thing in there if I could.
Yeah.
I've said this for years and, been lucky enough to be on some panels and been asked this question. The one thing that I will say about auto finance is no good deed ever goes unpunished. Right. So as we think about these things and we think about the regulatory landscape, the one thing that we all need to keep in mind as we move forward is that you have to treat the entire portfolio the same way. And every account needs to be treated the exact same way. And, as we think about that, it could, with the CFPB changes, give us an opportunity to relax and maybe not think about those. But I think at the end of the day, the CFPB, has been a gift for us, not always a good gift, but it's been a good gift for the industry to make us better, right? And to make us to where we are compliant and we do treat every customer the same way. And we are working for every dollar to add back to that portfolio in that account to give the smallest charge off amount to the customer that we can. So as we move forward into this slide, John, you want to take that away with the CFPB and what's changing there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this thing really is just, again, it's ever dynamic and ever changing, and there's different announcements that are made and then they're retracted. So really, when you're looking at leadership transitions, the current status is probably the magic 8 ball. Really, what's the best answer? Don't know. Obviously, there's been some nominations. There's some additional temporary directors in position now. What does that mean for the future of that leadership? Don't know yet. I mean, I think that there's obviously McKernan's name's been thrown around, Russell Vogt, Bissonnette, who's currently in there. Who will be the next nominee? I think that's still open for debate. What we're seeing there is also is kind of a partial pause on enforcement and supervision. These have all been made very public. You've seen the struggles that they've had also in personnel and the downsizing and DOGE being a part of going through and revamping government departments and systems. And then what's really interesting about that is the consumer complaint system is still active. And I actually went on to that consumer complaint system before we jumped on this call. And I can tell you about the last 4 complaints that were filed as early as June 2nd was attempted to collect a debt that was not owed, communication tactics, attempt to collect a debt that was not owed, customer was stated discharged in bankruptcy, and then again, erroneous loan data reporting. So those are the last 5 if you pull this up. So, consumers are active, they're reporting complaints. These are pretty material complaints when you think about what we just said earlier, where, hey, they're going to look at this entire process, and data is paramount because, if it's reporting erroneously with a credit reporting agency, which, obviously these things come to resolution, but you don't get to read it. They don't really tell you what happened. It just shows that it was addressed. But those are areas right now that are being actively mentioned on the complaint system. And then you have the CARS rule, right? They attempted to, but they found that there was a procedural misstep in that. They didn't really follow their own procedures. But guess who stepped in? California came out with their own CARS Act. And that's currently going through their Senate, and I don't think that it will have any issue getting passed there. Obviously, there'll be some negotiation on some of the things that they're attempting to include in that bill, because that bill actually is a little more stringent than what the FTC's CARS rule had stipulated in there for oversight into dealer transparency, product transparency, selling transparency, proper disclosures, right? Ensuring that customers were being presented with and finally closing on same terms. So it's a very interesting rule. I think that that's going to create a lot of additional work and systems for dealerships to deploy. Record keeping, for example, and record maintenance and record security. That's all has additional requirements listed in these bills. So I guess at the end of the day, federal oversight is pausing, but it's not disappearing. So Brooks, any additional insight on that?
No, I think it leads into our next topic, which is the state, level, and how you started to touch on it with California. And, you look at the states here that have been very active historically, right, in their own regulations. And I only see that continuing as we move forward, right? And so what have you seen out there in the market, and as you travel the country and talking to lenders, what are they saying from a state perspective?
First things first, lenders are not pulling back from things that they've put in place today. So even if we say the oversight and maybe some of the enforcement may be relaxed a little bit, lenders are like, look, there's an obligation that once we've put this in place, kind of once you've opened the box, you can't reseal it and say that you didn't know about it. So they're going to continue with the things that they had in place today, but it's giving them that additional opportunity to take a breath, pause, and optimize systems, optimize processes, right? That's what they're currently looking at today, because again, the CFPB may be scaling back enforcement, but they shifted all that oversight power into the state AGs, and the state AGs are accelerating to fill those gaps. And how are they doing that? Why are they accelerating? Well, before the administration changed, the CFPB had supplied their playbook, what their research had indicated, the direction that they were moving into the state AGs. And when you get into a state AG, if it's a predominantly one-party state or majority state, Usually your Senate, those are all composed of similar party affiliations. These bills pass quickly, right? With very little negotiation back and forth. I mean, some states already have proposed legislation headed to Senate floors. I think this will contribute to growing compliance patchwork. So if I'm operating in 4 states, 40 states, 50 states, now I need to pay attention. And this is really what our lenders are saying today. It's what is New Jersey doing differently than New York? What is Illinois doing different? What are my requirements? And Brooks, you said it perfectly earlier. It's like you need to treat these accounts, this portfolio, all under the same hood, right? Each account needs to be treated regardless of geographical location. That customer needs to be treated the same. So, and one last thing is I was on a similar podcast a week ago with credit unions and NCUA. So for our credit union partners out there listening to this, they have intensified oversight and audit activity. We're seeing it, we're hearing it. We've had an opportunity to give some of those folks that attended that podcast last week a brief glimpse into what can you expect, what are the questions being asked, and really, how do you prepare for any oversight or any type of committee or federal, state coming in and asking to do an audit and examination. How do you prepare for that? And what is it you think they'll be looking for that you can prepare in advance? That's kind of where our folks are at, Brooks.
Yeah, one of the other things to add to that, and this is something that not a lot of people think of, and as I've talked to lenders throughout the country that are multi-state footprint lenders, right? There's an additional cost. The CFPB, added its own layer of complexity, but as you have to dig into now, each state is going to have a different, set of rules, and how do you get your portfolio to be managed by, the most common of all the rules. There's additional costs that come into that, and additional auditing and additional monitoring. So it's not just as simple as, oh, the states are going to do their own thing. There is an additional cost. And I have talked to some lenders that, in certain states are going to pull back from lending because, the burden and the cost associated with the monitoring of some of those products and some of those policies that they're putting into place just don't fit with their business model. So I think we'll continue to see that until we get some clarity on what the FTC and the CFPB are going to do going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of giving you a general landscape, kind of what's going on, customers' feedback, some of the now I wouldn't say this is there's some of this information out there is kind of tough headwinds for the industry, but this industry is resilient. It has a savvy retailing component to it. These are very good operators. So the industry itself will continue. We've seen bumps in the road before. That will continue. So at the same time, as it relates to loss mitigation and recovery, there's opportunities there as well. I mean, there's a great opportunity to begin to pull in exogenous data sources to look at adjacent angle lenses of the consumer, your customer, to help recognize risk. New systems, new data, new technologies, things of that nature really help prepare you from a proactive standpoint as opposed to a reactive position. So, one of the things that we speak to about claim management, repayment agility, portfolio visibility, re-engagement. I'll give you a data example. We track 22 million accounts, automotive and mortgage for insurance through our systems. And 25% of these accounts are getting insurance or I'm sorry, are getting cancel notices on these insurance policies. So think of that. Customers getting onboarded into a new vehicle at the dealership, they supply proof of insurance. That customer had it for 1 month. They did not renew it because of the cost. So they're currently uninsured. Data like that, that's adjacent to what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis through your historical context and also through your current tools, is additional pieces that can really help with, hey, maybe there's something here with the consumer that if I see additional indicators through my other tools pointing me in a direction, it helps me clarify what next actions would be. So Brooks, you're in this knee deep. I mean, with ARM and everything that's going on, you see this stuff day to day.
Yeah. So if you really think about that from an overall loss mitigation strategy perspective, a couple different things. If you think about some of the things John talked about there with data, um, most lending organizations that I interact with on a regular basis, the very largest increase of staff is around risk and analytics and data. You know, the days of just adding more collectors is not what everybody is leaning into, right? It's technology, it's data, it's risk analytics. John talked a little bit about the changes in technology, right? It's not the day of, hey, I'm going to call a customer 3 times. It's, for example, Mr. Elias is late on this payment. I know the last 4 times I've talked to Mr. Elias, I've talked to him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm going to queue it up to call him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Right?
That's right.
So it's being smarter and using the data that we have to make better decisions and not be as wasteful as we are with our collections resources. Technology has also been a big player in that, right? As you talk about, text notifications, you talk about emails, how you reach people, right? The landscape has completely changed. The days are gone where 95% of the people have a landline. Everybody has a cell phone. They walk around with it, right? So the communication method has changed drastically. Emails and text messages are much more prevalent and they're much more automated, right? So that you can do those things where you're not having to go manually run a script to run text messages to somebody. So as we think about that and you think about how we re-engage our customer or re-engage the customers, right? When they're delinquent, well, what lenders are really trying to do is not let that vehicle get to repossession, right? And the interesting fact about this, and we see this in a couple of the products that we manage for our lender partners, is historically, what I call a positive close rate. So a customer comes current on an assigned repossession has been 15 to 18% in the market, John.
Wow.
We've got lenders that are in the 35% range because they're just, they're using the old school collection methods. And when we bring some of these new collection methods to them of text and emails and things like this that can be more automated in their systems, we've seen some of those lenders immediately see better recovery rates and better positive close rates, which means that those customers aren't going as delinquent as they historically have. So, everything that we see from a technology perspective, the increase in license plate recognition information and live updates from that, all of these things are leading to just a better experience in the portfolio. I just think how bad it would be if we didn't have these things in the portfolio. Delinquencies are up. We know it. They're at an all-time high. How bad would we be? Which shape would we be in? And you talked about that cliff, like 08. We might be running toward that cliff, John, if it weren't for some of this technology that's out there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. One amazing thing about working at Ally, and since we have point of sale products, is we see these customer engagement strategies, and maybe a lot of times on the account acquisition side of our lender's business, they invest heavily into, hey, how do I reach the customer? When is the best time to reach the customer? What's the best message? And the reason I say it's great for Ally is we can take all of that information and the learnings that we've had and the tools that we've put in place and say, well, wait a minute, let's unify the front end with the back end. Let's pass along the learnings that we have there, the technologies that have been created, because at the end of the day, it really comes about getting in front of your customer, being able to establish a dialogue in whatever way they want to be communicated to so that they respond at whatever time. You can determine how you can position these things. And then the behavior becomes learned, the messaging becomes learned, the outcomes become learned. So, I mean, without this technology, if we saw a 14.7% increase in our repos submitted to our organization. Can you imagine sitting at a lender without these tools and you're seeing an increase of 15%, 16%? To your point, you can't staff fast enough, and there's really not enough folks out there with this kind of experience to be staffed quickly enough to get you operationally more efficient.
Yeah. So as we close the session today, talk about what's ahead and the road ahead. John, what do you see the one or two things that are ahead that we need to be looking for?
I think there's if I were to look at two big themes, my first one would be for your compliance practices today, as it relates to the CFPB, as it relates to the FTC, there's an opportunity at this moment to really go in and refine those processes, make them more efficient, optimize them, build them a little bit more for the future, right? I think when these regulations come out, they come out rather quickly. You're scrambling to get things set up to address them. Now is an opportunity to take a deep breath, review it, optimize it. And I think for the second one would be really look at your data because there's a tremendous amount of data that's coming into your organization directly and through partnerships. There's so much value in that data that if you think about it broad range to say, hey, if I have this data, it would also enable me in the event that I needed to skip to have additional skip resources to go to. Haven't thought of it that way before. And I hate to keep harping on insurance, but if I was monitoring the insurance and I saw them switch a few different carriers, well, guess what? I would be able to backtrack through there and see if I could help locate where my customer's currently at and the collateral's at, right? So it's really an opportunity to say, hey, let's do some data. Let's take a look at our overall data picture. Let's take the time to organize it, hygiene it, and then really look for those opportunities of where can I add incremental lift to my internal processes through data that unconventionally I hadn't used.
Yeah, those are great points. The one thing that I think, from a portfolio perspective and from an environment, uh, overall environment is, we've got it on the slide here, is be agile, right? And so if things are going to change, they change quickly. A couple of weeks back, we went from, everything had 100% tariff on it to there's no tariffs, and then back to 20% tariffs, and nobody knows what's going on. And we see the stock market go up and down like a yo-yo, and block out all the noise, look at your portfolio, manage to the long-term future of your portfolio, not about what's going on today. And if you do that, doesn't mean that we're sticking our head in the sand and not paying attention to what's going on. But as long as we keep our eye on one thing, and that is making sure that our portfolio is performing the best it can from a long-term perspective, if we do those things, then I think we all win in the end. So that's the end of what we have to talk about today. Nick, any questions out there for us?
Absolutely. Great job, gentlemen. And forgive me for not mentioning it at the top of our webinar that if you do have questions for John and Brooks, just use the chat function here on the Zoom platform, and we'll use it the last couple of moments that we have here with the gentlemen in our time today. Their contact information and the company's contact information is there on the screen. And gentlemen, just a couple of thoughts as we wind down, leaning in a little bit to each of your industry histories and perspectives. Just first off, kind of two parts. How wild is it that just the sheer numbers that we're dealing with, that the prevalence of folks who have a monthly car payment of $1,000 or more, that their insurance might be several $100s, like what a monthly car payment used to be, quote unquote. Just how wild is that, and how important is it for managers and analysts to, as they're looking over these numbers, not to get overwhelmed by those figures, to kind of stay on points? I'd love to get each of your perspectives on kind of that two-part dynamic, that when you start really looking at the numbers.
So I'll jump in there first. And this is kind of interesting because I grew up in the car business. Nick, I think you know that. I went to my first auction when I was 6 years old. My dad ran dealerships my entire life. So I remember, growing up as a kid and seeing, $5,000 and $6,000 cars. And now I see that you can't replace a tire for what you used to be able to buy a car for in some cases, right? So, you think about that. The one thing I would say is it's not going to get any better with technology and some of the regulations that are around new vehicles and, autonomous vehicles. And I think we've kind of gotten to a plateau on EV versus ICE and where that's going to end up in the United States, at least for the next, 5 or 6 years. The one thing I would say is when you're looking at portfolios, make sure you're living into percentages, right? And living into trends. Forget about what the dollar amount is. That's going to continue to change. I think that the one percentage that is more prevalent than it's probably ever been is what is that value of that loan to the overall customer's income. And that is beginning to be more and more prevalent, where in some cases a car payment is as much as a house payment. And I don't know that I would have ever said that. I'm going to date myself, but 30 years ago when I started in this business.
Absolutely. John,
Yeah,
your perspective.
Nick, very, very interesting. I was going to go down kind of the same road as Brooks. When I was hanging paper at a dealership 30 years ago, I can't believe I'm saying that. P to I was 20%, couldn't exceed it, right? So you had a couple levers you could work with. You could try to extend the term, which back then, by the way, the longest loan term we had was 48 months. 60 months was a revelation. 72 months was unheard of. And here we are, we're at 96 months because the cost of the vehicle has gone from a brand new vehicle somewhere in the 30s. You could go out into any lot today and find vehicles priced easily from $70,000 to $100,000 for the vehicle that you're looking to buy. And I think that's the careful thing about underwriting. And I think it's really just a careful thing for our industry would be, let's ensure that we're putting the customers into a loan where they can perform. Let's ensure we're not taking the customer out of market for such a long period of time, because we need to see these vehicles coming back. I mean, leasing was great because there was always a replenishment of newer model used inventory that was coming in from lease, but we saw lease dip for the last few years, right? So we're missing that entire inventory replenishment. And we have folks now that are sitting into, I think 25%, if I remember the statistics correctly, of the automotive portfolios out there are in a negative equity situation of around $6,300. 5% of that 25% is at $15,000 plus. These folks are in vehicles where there is no easy out. You can't go and attempt to refi this thing if payment's going to go up because they're going to shorten term, or you're going to try getting it longer. And then it's a vehicle sustainability issue, right? You can't just attempt to roll that kind of money into a new loan. And I think that's the other thing is we just need to be conscious of, let's not get those consumers in those situations, because when they feel desperate, they're willing to do things that they shouldn't. And this is not financially responsible. And I think we need to be there to help these folks and say, point them in the right path, because it's good for the consumer and it's good for our industry.
Closing moments here on our webinar with two of the executive experts from Allied Solutions, John Elias and Brooks Stewart, as we navigate Fueling Forward, our mid-year risk review and outlook. And gentlemen, Brooks, we'll go back to you, and then John will have the last words. Kind of give you an opportunity to whatever moniker you want to put on it, head coach, motivational speaker, what have you, however you want to frame it, just a sort of a you can do this type of closing thought for our audience who are involved in risk mitigation and watching all these metrics, sort of a closing recommendation, encouragement for folks in the trenches in this part of auto finance. Brooks, will go to you, and then John to round us out.
Yeah, it's funny because we're using this internally in our operations group is back to basics, right? Get back to the basics of running a clean portfolio and the things that you need to do that. The one thing that I will say, and I think we all know this, that have been doing this for a long time, the only thing to expect is change, and it's going to change and it's going to continue to change. But if we continue to do the basics and the blocking and tackling that we need to do, then we'll be successful in our organizations.
Excellent. John.
One of the things that we speak to in regards to our compliance solutions and our customers, we use the phrase, you'll be judged tomorrow by the actions you take today. So ensure you have the opportunity now to really take a deep, long, hard look into current processes, retool them, build them better, build them so that they're scalable, because as Brooks mentioned, we're living in a very fluid industry and time right now where things as they were yesterday are different today, and we can't really anticipate tomorrow. We can plan for multiple scenarios, but we really have an opportunity to build our infrastructure, our practices, and just really run the culture of how we want to embrace this industry moving forward. Now is the opportunity to do it. And those that do it and do it really, really well, in the future, they'll be looked back and said, "Wow, you made great you had great judgment. You've taken great care of our customers. The consumer has had just a great experience with your organization, and it was all done compliantly, and it was all done, properly, for lack of a better word." So that's what we go by, Nick. So
Well said all around. That's Brooks Stewart and John Elias of Allied Solutions. And also want to give special recognition to the person who helped us get set up for success today, another member of the Allied Solutions team, Amanda Muller. So thank you again for getting us on the path to success for another successful webinar. Brooks, John, thank you again for the insights and perspectives. Always great to connect with you.
Thanks, Nick.
thank you, Nick.
And on behalf of all of us at Cherokee Media Group, my name is Nick Zulovich. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you again next time.